her story from North Carolina. My daughter said, the best gift would be if you died. So, I canceled her wedding fund and flew first class to Italy. I still remember the flicker of candles that night, 72 of them trembling on a white cake that looked far too elegant for a woman no one really celebrated anymore. The restaurant was one of those polished places in downtown Asheville, all glass and brass and low jazz humming under the chatter. My daughter, Renee, had insisted on planning it. "You deserve something classy, Mom," she'd said on the phone. I should have heard the ice behind her voice. When I arrived, she barely looked up from her phone. Jonathan, her fiancé, greeted me with that tight smile men give when they're just checking a box of good manners. I sat quietly at the end of the table while waiters poured champagne. Renee wore a red dress too sharp for the occasion, laughing too loud at her own jokes. I watched her the way mothers do, half proud, half worried, until she rose from her chair and clinked her glass for attention. "All right, everyone," she said, her tone bright and mocking. "Let's toast to the woman of the hour. My mother, Becky Lane, the strongest, most persistent reminder that life expectancy is too damn long." Laughter rippled around the table, uneasy but obedient. She turned toward me, her lips curling into something between a smile and a smirk. "Mom, the best gift you could give me is if you just died already. Then we could finally move on with our lives." The sound hit harder than I expected. It was not the words, but the way she said them, casual, rehearsed, as if cruelty were champagne talk. For a moment, I thought I had misheard, but Jonathan lifted his phone, filming, whispering, "Dark humor, babe, this will blow up online." People laughed again, some awkwardly, others with real amusement. My hands trembled beneath the tablecloth. I could hear the faint hum of the ceiling fan, the clink of ice, my own pulse echoing in my ears. I forced a smile. "Then maybe that will be your gift someday." The laughter thinned. Renee rolled her eyes. "Relax, Mom. It's a joke. You always take everything so seriously." She sat down and resumed scrolling her phone as if she had not just gutted her own mother in public. I watched her tilt her glass toward Jonathan, whispering something that made him chuckle. There was a hollow space in my chest, not pain exactly, but the kind of silence that fills the air before a storm. Around us, the restaurant carried on, waiters delivering plates, someone playing piano in the corner, a couple celebrating their anniversary with soft smiles. I wondered what they would think if they knew the old woman at the far table had just been told her death was a gift. If you feel justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button. Let us keep stories like this alive, echoing far, far away. Your support helps us bring understanding and love to those who deserve it. Thank you so much. Keep listening. After dinner, the staff brought out the bill. Renee was too busy posing for photos beside the dessert cart, her arm around Jonathan's waist. I quietly handed my card to the waiter. He looked surprised, whispering, "Ma'am, I thought it was covered by—" I shook my head. "It's fine." I signed the slip and tipped well. When I turned back, they were already leaving, laughing, the video of my humiliation probably uploading in real time. Outside, the night smelled of rain and smoke. Renee said to one of her friends in the parking lot, "She won't even remember it tomorrow. Old people forget fast." Her words carried in the wind like trash against pavement. I stood beside my car, holding the small gift bag she'd given me, a mug that said, "World's okayest mom." It was supposed to be funny, I suppose. I placed it on the passenger seat and stared at it until the label blurred. Then I started the engine and drove home in silence. The house felt too large, too tidy. Every photo on the wall told a story of a family that no longer existed. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the faint reflection of my face in the window. I thought about Edward, my late husband, and how steady his hands used to be when life got rough. He had once told me, during one of Renee's teenage storms, "Don't let your kindness be mistaken for weakness, Becky. The world will test it every chance it gets." I had spent my whole life trying to prove him wrong, that love could fix what pride broke. But that night, watching the reflection of candles still burning in my mind, I realized love, when thrown against greed and vanity, turns invisible. It was then I understood that I was done being invisible. The rain started outside, tapping gently against the window pane. Somewhere between the sound and the silence, I whispered to myself, "All right, Edward, let's see if I can still surprise them." That was the night I decided to give my daughter exactly what she wished for, not my death, but my disappearance. The house was too quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin. 40 years of memories hummed in the walls, but none of them belonged to me anymore. Renee's car was in the driveway, Jonathan's briefcase on the counter. They had moved in to take care of me, as they told the neighbors, but I knew what it really meant. It meant control, disguised as kindness. Sometimes I stood at the top of the stairs, listening to them talk downstairs. "We can't keep living like this," Renee would say. "That house could get us $500,000 easy if we just convince her it's too big." Jonathan would hum in agreement. "Your name's not on the deed yet, honey. We have to play it smart." She had always been like that, ever since she was little. When Edward, her father, hugged me after dinner, she'd glare and slam her door. When he brought me flowers, she'd mutter, "He never brings me anything." Even as a child, Renee wanted to win at love, not share it. When Edward died, she stood over the coffin and whispered through her teeth, "He worked himself to death because you always needed saving." I didn't answer her then. Grief doesn't leave room for arguments, but the words never left me. They became the echo in every hallway, the sound of every slam door since. By the time she and Jonathan moved in, my knees ached, and my patience had already thinned. They said it was temporary, just until the wedding. Within a week, my bedroom became their home office, and my photographs disappeared from the walls. Renee claimed she packed them to keep them safe. One afternoon, I came upstairs to find Jonathan measuring the living room with a tape measure. "Just checking space," he said, "in case we need to stage it later for the market." They told me I should move to the basement for convenience. The word stung. Convenience. They carried my chair, my books, and even my sewing kit down those narrow stairs. I protested once, only once. Renee's voice turned sharp. "We just want you safe, Mom. That's what good children do. You wouldn't want to fall and break a hip up here, would you?" In the dim light of that basement, I could hear the house breathing above me. Footsteps, laughter, clinking glasses, life going on without me. They locked the medicine cabinet one evening, said it was for my own good. My own good had started to sound a lot like a prison sentence. One night, I overheard them in the kitchen. Renee's voice was low but furious. The realtor said, "If Mom signs now, we could close before the wedding, but she's dragging her feet. I swear, she's doing it on purpose." Jonathan muttered something I couldn't make out, then laughed. "When she's gone, we'll have space for kids. Real ones." That word "gone" didn't mean death to them. It meant erasure. To them, I was just clutter with a pulse. I sat on the basement bed, running my hands over the worn quilt Edward and I had bought at a roadside stand in Boone. He used to say, "This house will always have a piece of us in it." I wondered what piece of me would remain when they sold it. The cracks in the stair, the faint smell of lavender from the linen closet, the stubborn woman buried in the deed. The next morning, Renee knocked on the basement door, smiling that sweet venom smile. "Morning, Mom. Jonathan and I are heading out to meet the realtor. Try not to go upstairs, okay? We're cleaning for photos." I nodded, watching the door close. The sound of her heels faded, but the silence that followed was heavier than before. I looked around the room that used to be a pantry and whispered, "I built this house, Renee, brick by brick with your father. You didn't inherit it, you moved into it." I walked to the small filing cabinet in the corner, the one they hadn't bothered to open. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was the original deed. Owner, Rebecca and Edward Lane, joint tenancy. My name, clear as sunlight. I smiled for the first time in weeks. For years, I had believed that patience was love, that forgiveness was strength. But as I held that paper, something shifted inside me. I realized love without respect is just submission, and patience without action is surrender. I slid the deed into my purse, closed the cabinet, and turned off the basement light. Upstairs, through the window, the "For Sale" sign leaned against the porch railing. I laughed softly. "Not yet," I whispered, "not by your hands." By the time Renee came home that evening, the sign was gone. She ran to the porch shouting, "Mom, what did you do?" I didn't answer. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a pen and a notebook, writing down names and numbers from memory lawyers, bankers, the people Edward once trusted. For the first time in months, I felt awake. When she stomped back inside, furious, she hissed, "You think you can stop me?" I looked her straight in the eye and said calmly, "No, sweetheart, I think I just started." The morning I walked into Asheville First Trust, the air smelled like polished wood and quiet money. The teller, a young man with bright hair and careful politeness, greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I told him I needed to make a transfer, something small on paper, but enormous in meaning. The account was under the name Renee Lane Wedding Fund. My late husband Edward had created it years ago, believing every daughter deserves to start her marriage with something beautiful. I once believed that too. But I had learned, painfully, that beauty means nothing when the heart behind it is rotten. The teller asked for my ID and documents. I handed them over, hands steady. He typed for a while, then looked up. "And what would you like the new account to be called, Mrs. Lane?" I took a deep breath and said, "Becky Lane Medical and Travel Fund." He nodded, hesitated, then asked, "May I ask the reason for the conversion?" I met his gaze and answered quietly, "Because the person it was meant for no longer needs love. She only wants inheritance." His fingers paused on the keyboard, and for a second, the room fell still. Then he nodded, almost respectfully. "Understood, ma'am." He disappeared for a few minutes, then returned with papers to sign. I signed slowly, savoring the deliberate movement of the pen. Every stroke felt like reclaiming air that had been stolen from my lungs. When he stamped the final page, he said, "Everything's in your name now, Mrs. Lane, legally and irrevocably." I smiled. That's one of my favorite words, irrevocably. Walking out of the bank, I could feel Edward beside me somehow, whispering that same calm strength he always carried. "You built it, Becky. You can rebuild it again." At home, I packed lightly. I didn't need much: my passport, one dress, and the small wooden box that held Edward's old watch and a photo from our honeymoon. I placed an envelope on the kitchen table. Inside it was a note, written in my neatest hand. "You wanted me gone." I listened. 2 days later, while my plane was already in the sky, Renee stormed into the very same bank, veil of entitlement wrapped around her like perfume. "Hi," she chirped, tapping the counter. "I need to transfer from the Renee Lane Wedding Fund. My wedding planner's waiting for confirmation." The same teller blinked at her. "I'm sorry, miss, but that account has been closed by the trustee." She frowned, confused. "Closed? What are you talking about?" It was legally converted to another fund. The primary trustee was Mrs. Rebecca Lane. Renee's face drained of color. Her voice rose, brittle and sharp. "That senile woman stole my money." People in line turned to stare. The teller, bless him, didn't flinch. Mrs. Lane acted within her rights. She was the sole trustee. Renee slammed her hand on the counter, shaking. "You don't understand. She's insane. She's old." He just repeated, gently but firmly, "The account was hers to manage, ma'am." Her voice cracked into something raw and childish. "But it was mine. It was supposed to be mine." When she came home that evening, the house was silent. No faint hum of the kettle, no scent of cinnamon tea, no soft radio playing old Sinatra. Just silence, heavy and accusing. She tore through the rooms, calling my name like it was an insult. "Mom, where the hell are you?" Her heels echoed across the hardwood floor. Then she noticed the envelope still on the table, my handwriting looping across the paper. She opened it, read the single line, and froze. Her hand trembled as she looked around. The family photos were gone from the walls. The jewelry box was empty. The basement door hung open. She ran to my room, yanked open the closet. Inside, she found a small velvet box left on the top shelf. Inside it was an old photograph of Edward, smiling at me under Italian sunlight, and 2 faded boarding passes marked Rome, Leonardo da Vinci Airport. That was where I first learned what freedom tasted like. Renee sat on the floor, shaking, muttering to herself. She wouldn't dare. But I had. I had dared to remember who I was before they made me a ghost in my own house. The following morning, her text messages flooded my phone, half anger, half panic. "Where are you? What did you do? You ruined everything." I didn't reply. I was already watching the clouds drift beneath the plane window, the sky a vast field of quiet I hadn't felt in years. The hum of the engines was steady, like a heartbeat returning to rhythm. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for someone to save me. I was flying towards something that might. And as the seatbelt light flickered on, I whispered into the cabin air, "Goodbye, Renee. This time, it's you who'll be left behind." The hum of the jet engines was softer than I expected, steady, almost comforting, like the sound of calm after a long storm. I sat in seat 1A, legs wrapped in a cashmere blanket, the air faintly scented with citrus and champagne. The stewardess called me Mrs. Lane, with a smile so warm it almost made me cry. It had been decades since anyone said my name with respect. I looked down at the gold-trimmed ticket on my tray table. Charlotte to Rome, first class. Paid for by the same fund once labeled Renee Lane Wedding Fund. There was something poetic about it. Her dream wedding turned into my escape. The man across the aisle kept glancing at me, probably wondering why a silver-haired woman was sitting among businessmen and influencers. I didn't care. For the first time in years, I wasn't background noise in my own life. I was movement. I was choice. The seat beside me was soon filled by a woman with sharp eyes and a calm confidence that came from a life of winning arguments. She extended her hand. "Iris Coleman," she said. "Retired, though I still dabble when paperwork calls for it." "Becky Lane," I replied, shaking her hand. She smiled knowingly. "You have the look of someone who just did something important." I laughed softly. Maybe, or something my daughter would call unforgivable. The plane began to taxi down the runway. As the engines roared to life, I told her everything: how my daughter had humiliated me, how she and her fiancé tried to sell the house, how I'd finally transferred the fund and left without a word. Iris listened without interrupting, only nodding now and then. When I finished, she said simply, "Justice isn't revenge, Mrs. Lane, it's documentation." I tilted my head. "Documentation?" She leaned closer. "If people lie with words, the truth has to live in paper. A signature can outlive a betrayal." Her words hit me with the same quiet force that Edward's once did. I thought of the empty rooms back home, the boxes of photos I'd left behind, and the way my daughter's laughter had echoed when she called me senile. I looked out the window, the clouds glowing pink in the sunrise, and whispered, "Then maybe it's time my truth was written down." Iris smiled. "You have a pen, don't you?" We spent the next hour drafting on the back of the airline's stationery, her handwriting neat and legal, mine shaky but determined. The new will began with simple words. "I, Rebecca Lane, being of sound mind, leave my remaining estate not to blood, but to worth." By the time we reached cruising altitude, the foundation had a name: Haven of Grace. It would serve women like me, the ones erased by their own children, the forgotten mothers who once built homes only to be exiled from them. Iris helped me outline the trust. "We'll make sure it's ironclad," she said, sipping her coffee. "If they try to contest, the court will eat them alive." For the first time, I didn't feel like a victim of age. I felt like a witness reclaiming her own testimony. At 35,000 feet above the Atlantic, I signed my name at the bottom of that makeshift draft. My hand trembled, not from fear but from the weight of release. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in a kitchen cluttered with half-packed wedding boxes, Renee sat crying into her phone camera. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks as she hit record. "My mom's lost it," she said, voice thick with false pain. "She ran away to Europe with my wedding fund, my own mother." She uploaded it with the caption, "Runaway Mom." Within hours, the video spread like wildfire. Some called me cruel, others called her greedy. Morning talk shows debated who the real victim was. But one comment, buried under thousands, caught fire on its own. Maybe she didn't run from sanity, maybe she just ran from hell. When I landed in Rome, my phone buzzed non-stop, notifications lighting up the screen like fireworks. I turned it off, slipped it into my purse, and stepped out into the golden morning air. The taxi driver smiled when I gave him the address of a small villa Edward and I once stayed at decades ago. "Ah, Signora Lane," he said. "For vacation?" I looked out at the skyline of domes and terracotta roofs, the air alive with church bells and life. "For freedom," I said. As we drove, I imagined Renee watching her comments section turn against her, every cruel word she'd said replayed for millions to judge. She wanted fame, now she had infamy. I didn't need to say a thing. The world had already spoken. Back on the plane, Iris's voice echoed in my head. "Justice isn't revenge. It's documentation." And I realized she was right. My departure wasn't an act of vengeance. It was a signature on a life I had finally reclaimed. That night, as I unpacked in my quiet Roman room, I poured a glass of red wine, raised it toward the open window, and whispered to the stars, "To new beginnings, signed and sealed." Outside, the city hummed softly below, and somewhere across the ocean, my name trended not as a scandal, but as a symbol. The first headline appeared on a Tuesday morning. "Bride to be caught, faking her mother's signature for cash." I was in Rome, drinking espresso on a balcony overlooking the piazza, when Iris forwarded me the article. The photo beneath the headline showed Renee leaving the bank in tears, her face half hidden behind oversized sunglasses. The irony was poetic. The same daughter who once mocked me for not knowing how to use online banking was now trending for attempted financial fraud. It had started small, Iris explained over the phone. Jonathan, ever the opportunist, had convinced Renee that nothing was really stolen if it was already hers. He'd said it with that same smug logic that young men use when greed sounds too much like a plan. Together, they found an old file of mine, one that contained a scanned copy of my signature from the first trust documents Edward and I signed decades ago. They printed it, forged a few authorization letters, and marched into Asheville First Trust like actors in a bad heist film. The clerk they approached had dealt with me personally for years. He noticed the difference immediately. The B in my name was slanted wrong, the ink pressure uneven. He politely took the papers, smiled, and said he'd process them right away. Then he pressed the red button under his desk that flagged fraud suspicion. Within hours, the bank had frozen every account linked to Renee's name and sent an automatic alert to the Financial Exchange Board. By evening, Iris had already received a courtesy call. "They tried to impersonate you," she said, half amused, half furious. "You have a case without lifting a finger." She drafted a letter that same night, formal and merciless. "To whom it may concern," it began, "I, Rebecca Lane, confirm that I did not authorize any recent transactions or signatures executed in my name. The parties involved are my daughter, Renee Lane, and her fiancé, Jonathan Pierce. I am represented by legal counsel, Miss Iris Coleman, who will provide notarized evidence of the attempted forgery." By Wednesday morning, every major local outlet in North Carolina had picked up the story. Reporters camped outside the couple's rented townhouse, their microphones aimed like weapons. Renee, desperate, released another video, this one tearful. "My mom's sick," she sobbed. "She doesn't know what she's doing. I was just trying to protect what's rightfully mine." But the internet doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive hypocrisy. People dug up her previous viral clip, the one where she'd laughed about me being crazy enough to run off to Europe. They compared her words, frame by frame. Hashtags shifted overnight, from runaway mom to runaway daughter. By Thursday, Jonathan had stopped answering her calls. A week later, his statement appeared in the papers. "I was unaware of any illegal actions. I wish Miss Lane the best, but I can't be associated with this scandal." He left behind only a text message on her phone. "You're bad press, Renee." I stared at that line for a long time after Iris read it aloud. It was the kind of cruelty that doesn't need shouting. Quiet, sharp, final. The story grew legs. Talk shows debated whether entitled heirs should face stricter penalties. Bank analysts discussed fraud prevention. Comment sections filled with strangers saying things like, "That mother deserves peace," and "Justice has a long memory." And indeed, justice remembered. Iris forwarded me a copy of the bank's official letter. "This case has been referred to the Fraudulent Claims Division for investigation." The attempted authorization of forged documents constitutes a felony offense under federal banking law. It was signed, stamped, and irreversible, just like my new trust. I thought about Edward that night as I sat on the terrace, the lights of Rome flickering across the cobblestones. He'd once told me, "The law may walk slow, but it never forgets its path." Now I understood. I didn't need revenge or confrontation or screaming. All I needed was truth written down and time to let it work. Renee's world collapsed without a single word from me. The wedding venue canceled her reservation. Sponsors pulled out. Her friends stopped replying to her posts. The internet had turned her cruelty into a cautionary tale. Back in North Carolina, the evening news showed her walking into the courthouse, face pale, lips trembling, surrounded by reporters shouting questions she couldn't answer. I turned off the TV before the verdict. I didn't need to hear it. The outcome had already been written in her own handwriting, the one she'd tried so hard to fake. I looked over at Iris, who had joined me for dinner that evening. "Do you ever think justice takes too long?" I asked. She poured herself another glass of wine and smiled. "Sometimes, but it always arrives on time for those patient enough to wait." And as the city bells rang across the rooftops, I realized something simple and profound. The universe doesn't always punish cruelty with thunder. Sometimes it uses paperwork, patience, and a single, perfect signature. The courtroom in Buncombe County felt colder than it should have, even with sunlight spilling through the tall windows. Maybe it was the marble floors or the silence that always comes before judgment. The benches were full reporters, curious locals, even a few faces I didn't recognize. Everyone wanted to see the wedding fund scandal woman in person. Renee sat at the defense table, her hair tied up, her expression fragile in that deliberate way people perform regret. She wore beige, the color of caution. Her attorney whispered something into her ear, but she didn't seem to hear. Jonathan wasn't there. He'd already run, leaving her to clean up the mess they'd made together. When the bailiff called the room to order, the sound of the gavel echoed like a heartbeat through the chamber. Court is now in session. The state of North Carolina versus Renee Lane, charged with identity fraud and breach of trust. Iris sat beside me, her notes perfectly aligned, her calm unshaken. "Just breathe," she murmured. "This isn't about revenge, it's about record." The judge, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and silver hair, pulled back tight. Read through the charges slowly, clearly. Each word landed like a weight on the air. Forgery, falsified authorization, and attempted withdrawal of assets under fraudulent pretenses, she said. All committed against the plaintiff, Rebecca Lane, her own mother. The reporters scribbled furiously. The microphones hummed. Renee's attorney stood, his voice coated in false courtesy. "Your Honor, my client was emotionally distressed. She believed her mother's mental state had declined and acted out of confusion, not malice." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Confusion doesn't usually involve printing forged signatures, does it, counselor?" He faltered. It was a moment of weakness. 2 forged documents, 1 wire transfer attempt, and 1 false identity verification? She interrupted. "That's a long moment." A few people chuckled quietly in the back row. Renee's jaw clenched. Then the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Lane, do you wish to make a statement?" I stood, steady though my knees protested. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom went still. My voice came out soft but firm. "I don't wish her harm. I only wish she'd remembered that parenthood is love, not debt. We give because we want to, not because we owe. And when love becomes a transaction, the whole family goes bankrupt." Renee suddenly slammed her hand on the table, eyes wet, voice shaking. "She's my mother. She owes me everything, every chance, every dollar, every sacrifice she made. It was for me. I'm her blood." The room went silent again, but this time it was heavy. The judge looked at her for a long moment, then asked quietly, "Do you believe love comes with a receipt, Miss Lane?" Renee's lips trembled, but no words came. The judge sighed. "Miss Lane, the court understands the pain of family conflict, but betrayal wrapped in entitlement is still betrayal, and the law does not bow to inheritance fantasies." Iris leaned toward me and whispered, That might be the most poetic thing I've ever heard from a judge. The gavel came down once, crisp and final. The court sentences the defendant to financial penalties equivalent to the attempted fraud amount, probation under fiscal supervision, and permanent revocation of her investor status within the state of North Carolina. Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters began typing faster. Cameras clicked. Renee covered her face with her hands, sobbing not from remorse, I suspected, but from the public unraveling of her pride. The lawyer tried to comfort her, but she shrugged him off. The judge turned to me again. "Mrs. Lane, you've conducted yourself with remarkable dignity throughout this process. I hope today brings you peace." I nodded gently. "Peace doesn't need a courtroom, Your Honor, but it helps when truth has witnesses." The judge smiled faintly. "That it does." When the gavel struck for the last time, the case was closed. Outside, the courthouse steps were lined with journalists. I didn't stop for interviews, but I couldn't help overhearing one headline shouted above the noise: "The classy grandma who outsmarted greed." It was strange hearing myself described that way, classy, like it was a shield I'd polished to survive all this. Maybe it was. As I walked to the car, Iris held the door open for me. "How does it feel?" she asked. I thought for a moment, like I finally stopped apologizing for surviving. We drove past the courthouse, and I caught a glimpse of Renee standing alone at the top of the steps, reporters crowding around her. The same woman who once told me I'd die forgotten was now being remembered for all the wrong reasons. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just whispered to myself, justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just signs its name neatly at the bottom of the page. And as the car pulled away under the Carolina sun, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Quiet dignity, unshakable and earned. The streets of Florence glowed like old gold that morning, soft and forgiving, as if the city itself understood rebirth. My little house stood on the edge of Via dei Bardi, 2 rooms, 1 courtyard, and a view of the Arno that changed color with the hours. I'd bought it with what was left after closing my accounts in North Carolina. The neighbors thought I was a retired librarian. Maybe in a way, I was archiving stories, collecting what the world tried to throw away. The brass plaque beside the door read, "Haven of Grace, per le donne dimenticate," for forgotten women. It was Iris's idea to translate it into Italian. "Makes it sound timeless," she'd said. And maybe it was. Every Sunday, I hosted what the locals started calling Sunday tea. There were no formal invitations, no sign-up sheets. Women simply showed up, sometimes 3, sometimes 10, carrying more pain than luggage. Some were widows, some divorced, others simply erased by their own children. They came for tea, but mostly for listening. That afternoon, the table was full. The air smelled of lemon biscuits and lavender soap. The women spoke in low tones, their stories weaving like threads of the same fabric. A daughter who sold her mother's house, a son who borrowed and never returned, a niece who forged a will. I didn't interrupt. I let silence do the healing. It always knows where to touch first. After a while, one of the younger visitors, a girl named Sophia, looked up from her cup. She was barely 30, with dark eyes too old for her age. "Mrs. Lane," she asked softly in accented English, "why do you help strangers?" The question hung there, simple and sharp. I smiled, feeling the warmth of the tea seep into my palms. "Because I know how it feels when your own forget you." The room went quiet for a heartbeat. Then one of the older women, Luciana, who had lost her home to her son's gambling debts, reached across the table and took my hand. "Then we remember each other," she said. I nodded. "That's the idea." Outside, the bells of Santa Croce began to ring, deep and slow, each note carrying through the narrow streets like a promise. Later, after everyone had left, I stood by the window, with the last cup of tea still warm in my hands. Across the street, an elderly man was teaching a little boy how to toss breadcrumbs to pigeons. The child laughed, pure and careless. The man smiled with the kind of love that didn't need forgiveness. I pressed my palm against the cool glass. My hand looked older now, thin skin, pale veins, lines carved like the roads I'd walked to get here. But the reflection in the glass wasn't sad, just still. Behind me, the walls of Haven of Grace were lined with framed letters, thank you notes from women who'd rebuilt their lives, signed deeds, reopened bank accounts, or simply found the courage to move forward. Some had scrawled in shaky handwriting, "You helped me believe I wasn't crazy." Others wrote, "You made me feel seen." I'd stopped counting how many had come. It didn't matter. What mattered was that every week, laughter replaced tears a little faster. That evening, Iris called from the States. "Your little project is making headlines again," she said. "They're calling you the Grandma of Grace. CNN wants an interview." I laughed softly. "Tell them the only interview they'll get is if they show up for Sunday tea." She chuckled. "I'll pass that along." After we hung up, I walked out into the courtyard. The sun was dipping low, painting everything in amber. The wind carried the faint smell of jasmine. I closed my eyes and thought of Edward, how he used to hum while fixing the fence, how his hands always smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. "You were right, love," I whispered. "Wealth isn't what you keep. It's what you give away without losing anything." The light shifted, brushing my face through the vines. Somewhere in the distance, a violin played, a street musician maybe, or just the city itself humming a lullaby. And as the last ray of light touched my wrinkled hands, I realized healing doesn't erase the past, it simply teaches it how to rest. The lights in the studio gleamed like sunrise against polished glass. I could see my reflection in the camera lens, older, softer, but no longer small. The producer counted down from 5, and before I knew it, the red light blinked on. I was live on Good Morning America. The host smiled at me the way people do when they're both curious and cautious. "Mrs. Lane," she began, her voice practiced yet warm, "your story touched millions. The video of your daughter's words, 'The best gift would be if you died,' broke the internet. What went through your mind in that moment?" The studio went quiet. Even the crew behind the cameras stilled. I leaned forward, my fingers folded in my lap. "Honestly," I said, "that I'd rather be laughed at once than live as someone's joke forever." A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. The host blinked, then nodded slowly. "That's powerful. And yet, you seem peaceful now." I smiled faintly. "Because I stopped fighting for an apology from people who confuse inheritance with love. You can't change how someone sees you, but you can change what you give your heart to." She leaned in. "And now you've founded Haven of Grace in Florence, a refuge for women betrayed by their own families? That's extraordinary." "It's ordinary kindness," I said. "We just forget how powerful it can be when we give it a home." The applause that followed was soft but honest, the kind that fills a room without drowning it. Somewhere in the back row, I caught the eye of a young woman, tears on her cheeks. I wondered if she saw her own story reflected in mine. When the segment ended, the host squeezed my hand. "Thank you for reminding us that dignity doesn't age." Afterward, in the dressing room, I sat for a moment under the bright mirrors. My reflection looked tired, yes, but the kind of tired that comes after finishing something worth doing. A producer knocked gently and said, "Your car's waiting, Mrs. Lane." "Not a car," I said, smiling. "A plane." By evening, I was back at JFK Airport. The world outside the windows was a blur of moving lights and whispered announcements. As I handed my boarding pass to the attendant, she glanced at the destination. "First class to Rome, ma'am," she said with a grin. "Traveling alone?" "Not really," I replied, fastening my coat. "My dignity's coming with me." She laughed, genuine and bright. "Best travel companion I've heard of." On the plane, I settled into my seat, the hum of engines steady beneath me. A glass of champagne shimmered under the reading light. Outside, the runway stretched like a promise waiting to take shape. As the plane lifted off, the lights of New York shrank below, tiny, glittering, and far away. I thought about all that had happened, the betrayal, the humiliation, the quiet justice that followed. And then I thought of the women in Florence, the way they smiled again after months of shame. Healing wasn't just about starting over, it was about reclaiming what had never truly been lost. The stewardess passed by, asking softly if I needed anything. I shook my head. "No, thank you. I have everything I need." She smiled, moving on, and I looked out the window once more. The clouds drifted beneath us like silk. Somewhere down there, Renee was probably still searching for the next thing to blame. But I didn't wish her harm. I wished her understanding, though I knew some lessons only come when the noise runs out. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small envelope addressed in my handwriting. Inside was a letter not to my daughter, but to myself. I had written it the night before my birthday in Florence. You are not defined by who left, but by who stayed true. You kept your name, your grace, and your peace. That is your inheritance. I smiled, folded it back, and tucked it beside my passport. The plane dipped slightly, catching the sun at the perfect angle. The whole cabin glowed gold. Somewhere between sky and earth, I whispered the final truth out loud, my voice barely louder than the hum of the engines. They wished for my death. I gave them a life worth remembering. And that, dear listeners, was the story of Becky Lane, the woman who turned heartbreak into heritage and built a home for those the world forgot. If her courage moved you, if you believe that dignity and justice never go out of style, don't let this be where it ends. Hit that subscribe button to join our growing family at Grandma-True Stories, where every tale is proof that strength doesn't fade with age. And hey, if you believe justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button. Help us keep stories like Becky's alive, echoing far, far away. Because here at Grandma-True Stories, we don't just tell what happened. We remind the world that kindness never retires and truth never dies.